The morphine made everything feel like I was floating in thick honey, but I could still hear them perfectly clearly in the hallway outside my hospital room. My daughter Betty's voice, sharp and impatient, cutting through the antiseptic air like a blade. When will she just die already? This is taking forever, and I have the realtor coming Thursday to look at her house. My son Michael's deeper voice, equally callous. The life insurance alone is $200,000, plus the house is worth at least $450 in this market. We could split it and both get our kids through college without any more of this burden. Betty again, that brittle laugh I'd heard so many times when she thought I wasn't listening. Burden is right. At least when she's gone, we won't have to pretend to care anymore. God, the way she calls every day wanting to chat, it's exhausting. I lay there in that narrow hospital bed, fresh from my second hip replacement surgery, feeling something cold and final settle in my chest like the tip of a needle. These were my children, the babies I'd nursed through midnight fevers, the toddlers whose scraped knees I'd kissed, the teenagers whose broken hearts I'd mended with homemade cookies and endless patience, the young adults whose student loans I'd co-signed, whose down payments I'd helped with, whose children I'd babysat every weekend for the past 8 years so they could have a life. The children who were standing in a hospital corridor discussing my death like a business transaction. You know, there's something profoundly clarifying about hearing your own children wish you dead. It strips away every illusion, every hopeful rationalization, every excuse you've made for their increasing coldness over the years. I'd been telling myself that Betty was just busy with her marketing job, that Michael was stressed about his failing marriage, that their distance was temporary, circumstantial, that underneath it all, they still loved me the way I loved them, completely, unconditionally, without reservation. But love doesn't calculate life insurance payouts while you're recovering from surgery. I closed my eyes and let the morphine carry me back to the beginning, to understand how we'd gotten here, how the woman who dedicated her entire adult life to her children had become nothing more than a financial asset to them, a burden they were eager to shed. I was 19 when I married their father, Victor, 20 when Betty was born, 22 when Michael arrived. Victor was a good man, steady and kind, but he died of a heart attack when the kids were still in middle school. Suddenly, I was a widow at 38, working 2 jobs to keep us afloat, making sure they had everything they needed, even if it meant I went without. I remember those years so clearly now, coming home from my day job at the insurance office to find them doing homework at the kitchen table, then heading out to my evening shift cleaning offices so they could have new school clothes, so Betty could take dance lessons, so Michael could play Little League. I'd collapse into bed at midnight and get up at 5 to make their breakfast, pack their lunches, make sure they felt loved and secure despite losing their father. Every sacrifice felt worth it when Betty graduated valedictorian, when Michael got that baseball scholarship. I was so proud, so sure I'd done right by them. Even when Victor's life insurance ran out, even when I had to take out a second mortgage to help with their college expenses, it felt like an investment in their future, in our family. But somewhere along the way, their gratitude had curdled into entitlement. It started small. Betty forgetting to call on Mother's Day, Michael being too busy to visit for Thanksgiving. Then Betty met Derek, and suddenly I wasn't good enough for their social circle. "Mom, you can't wear that to the rehearsal dinner," she'd said, eyeing my best dress with distaste. What will Derek's parents think? What they thought, apparently, was that I was an embarrassment. Betty began introducing me as Derek's mother-in-law's friend at their country club events, as if acknowledging me as her mother would somehow diminish her status. And Derek had this way of looking right through me, as if I were furniture. Useful furniture, granted, since I was the free babysitter for their twins, Emma and James, but furniture nonetheless. Michael's wife, Jennifer, was worse. She had this breathy, syrupy way of talking to me that made my skin crawl. "Oh, Patricia, you're such a saint," she'd coo, handing me the diaper bag as she and Michael headed out for another weekend getaway. "We just don't know what we'd do without you. You're like our little helper." Our little helper. As if I were their employee instead of their children's grandmother. But I told myself this was just how modern families worked, that I was being old-fashioned, expecting too much. That the important thing was staying connected to my grandchildren, being part of their lives, so I swallowed my pride and played the role they'd assigned me, the convenient grandmother, always available, never demanding, grateful for whatever scraps of attention they threw my way. I should have seen the pattern emerging, the way they'd call only when they needed something, babysitting, money, help with home repairs, the way they'd make plans without including me, then act surprised when I felt left out. "Oh, Mom, we thought you'd be tired," Betty would say. You're always saying how busy you are. I was busy, busy taking care of their children, busy maintaining the house that would apparently be their inheritance, busy working part-time at the library to supplement my Social Security so I wouldn't be a burden on them financially. The cruelest part was how they trained me to be grateful for the bare minimum. When Betty remembered to call on my birthday, when Michael stopped by without needing anything, I'd feel this pathetic surge of happiness, like a dog getting a scrap from the table. I'd convinced myself that this was enough, that expecting more was selfish. But lying in that hospital bed, listening to them discuss my death with the same enthusiasm they'd show planning a vacation, I realized I'd been living a lie for years. The nurse came in around midnight to check my vitals, a kind woman named Rosa who'd been taking care of me since the surgery. She must have seen something in my face because she sat down in the visitor's chair and took my hand. "You okay, honey? You look upset." I almost told her. Almost spilled everything about what I'd heard, about the crushing realization that my children saw me as nothing more than an ATM with a pulse. But something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was the certainty that nothing she could say would change the fundamental truth of my situation. Instead, I asked her something that had been nagging at me. "Rosa, when patients are here for extended stays, do family members ever ask about financial arrangements? About how long recovery might take?" Her expression grew carefully neutral. "Sometimes family members have questions about insurance coverage, yes. Why do you ask?" "Did my children ask you anything like that?" She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her weighing professional discretion against human kindness. Finally, she said, "Your daughter asked me yesterday about your prognosis, whether we expected any complications that might extend your stay." The way she said it told me everything I needed to know. Betty hadn't been asking out of concern for my well-being. She'd been asking because she had a realtor coming Thursday. "Thank you for being honest," I said. Rosa squeezed my hand. "Mrs. Patterson, I've been a nurse for 23 years. I've seen a lot of families, and I want you to know what I heard in that hallway tonight, that's not normal. That's not how children should talk about their mother." So she'd heard it too. Somehow that made it both better and worse. Better because I wasn't going crazy, wasn't misunderstanding. Worse because it meant my shame was witnessed, my failure as a mother was public. After Rosa left, I lay in the darkness thinking about my life, about the choices that had led me here. I thought about Victor, about how he'd always said I was too generous for my own good. "Patty," he'd tell me, "you can't pour from an empty cup. Sometimes you have to say no." But saying no had never been in my vocabulary, especially not with my children. Even after Victor died, even when money was tight, I'd find ways to say yes. Yes to dance lessons, yes to the expensive graduation party, yes to co-signing loans, yes to down payment help, yes to endless weekends of free babysitting. I'd said yes so many times that they'd forgotten I had the power to say no, but they'd also forgotten something else. They'd forgotten that before I was their mother, before I was their convenient helper, I was Patricia Ann Patterson, Victor's widow, who'd navigated single motherhood and financial hardship for 15 years. They'd forgotten that I was the woman who'd managed to keep our family afloat through sheer determination and careful planning. They'd forgotten that I was smarter than they thought. You see, when you're a widow with 2 children and limited income, you learn to be very, very careful with money. You learn to plan for every contingency, to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. And over the past 30 years, while they'd been assuming I was just scraping by on Social Security and my part-time library job, I'd been quietly, methodically building something they knew nothing about. The house they were so eager to inherit? I'd paid off the mortgage 12 years ago. The life insurance policy they were counting on? That was just one of 3. The struggling widow they'd been condescending to for years? She had investments they'd never dreamed of, property they'd never seen, accounts in banks they'd never heard of. Victor had been in insurance, and he'd taught me well before he died. The key to financial security, he'd always said, is diversification and discretion. Never put all your eggs in one basket, and never let anyone know how many baskets you have. I'd taken his advice to heart. While Betty and Michael had been assuming I was barely getting by, I'd been living well below my means and investing the difference. The modest lifestyle, the careful budgeting, the part-time job, it was all by choice, not necessity. I could have retired years ago, could have traveled, could have enjoyed my money instead of hoarding it. But I'd been saving it for them, for their children's college funds, for family emergencies, for a future I'd imagined we'd share. That future died in the hospital corridor along with their cruel words. The next morning, Betty and Michael came to visit, bringing flowers and fake smiles. Betty perched on the edge of the visitor's chair, checking her phone every few minutes, while Michael stood by the window looking uncomfortable. "How are you feeling, Mom?" Betty asked, her voice dripping with that false sweetness I now recognized as pure performance. "Much better," I said quietly. "The doctor says I'll be able to go home tomorrow." "That's wonderful," Michael said, a little too enthusiastically. "Do you need us to help you with anything? Groceries, cleaning, that sort of thing?" Such thoughtful children, offering to help with my recovery. If I hadn't heard them the night before, I might have been touched by their concern. "No, I think I'll manage, I said. "I've been managing on my own for quite some time now." Something in my tone must have caught Betty's attention because she looked up from her phone. "Mom, you sound different. Are you sure you're okay?" I met her eyes steadily. "I'm fine, Betty. Just thinking about some changes I need to make." "Changes?" Michael asked. "Nothing dramatic," I said. "Just prioritizing differently, focusing on the people who actually care about me." They exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Guilt, perhaps, or just confusion about my unexpected directness. "Of course we care about you, Mom," Betty said. "You're being silly." Silly. There was that word again, the one they'd used to dismiss my feelings for years. Silly for wanting to be included in family plans, silly for expecting gratitude after years of sacrifice, silly for thinking my death should mean more to them than a real estate transaction. "You're right," I said. "I have been silly, but I'm learning." They stayed for another awkward 20 minutes, making small talk that felt like dental work. When they finally left, promising to check on me over the weekend, I felt nothing but relief. That afternoon, I called my lawyer. Douglas Henley had been Victor's friend since college, and he'd been handling my legal affairs for 30 years. He was one of the few people who knew the real extent of my finances, and he'd been after me for years to be more transparent with my children about my assets. "Patricia," he'd say during our annual meetings, "they're going to get quite a shock when they see what you've actually accumulated. Wouldn't it be better to involve them in the planning now?" I'd always resisted. Part of it was wanting to surprise them, to give them security they didn't know they had. But part of it, I now realized, was wanting to maintain some control, some leverage. As long as they thought I was financially dependent, I still felt needed. Well, I didn't want to be needed anymore. I wanted to be wanted, valued, respected. And if that wasn't possible, I at least wanted to be honest. "Douglas Viance," I said when he answered the phone, "I need to see you as soon as possible. I want to make some significant changes to my estate plan." "Of course, Patricia. Is everything all right? You sound upset." I almost laughed. Upset was such an inadequate word for the seismic shift happening inside me. "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. I'm finally seeing things clearly." We scheduled a meeting for the following Monday. In the meantime, I had some research to do. It's amazing what you can accomplish from a hospital bed with a smartphone and a wireless internet connection. By the time Rosa came in with my discharge papers, I'd researched retirement communities in Florida, looked into long-term care insurance policies, and started a list of charitable organizations that might benefit from my eventual generosity. I'd also done something I should have done years ago. I'd looked up the actual value of my various investments and properties. The number that stared back at me from my phone screen was almost comical in its contrast to my children's assumptions about my finances. While they were calculating how to split a $200,000 life insurance payout and a $450,000 house, I was sitting on assets worth just over $2.3 million. $2.3 million that they knew nothing about. The house they were so eager to inherit was just the tip of the iceberg. There was the rental property in Arizona that I'd bought 15 years ago, the diversified investment portfolio that Douglas had been managing, the CDs that had been quietly compounding for decades, and yes, the 3 life insurance policies, not just the one they knew about. I'd been wealthy for years and living like a pauper, saving every penny for children who saw me as a burden to be endured, well, no more. Rosa wheeled me down to Michael's car in the required wheelchair, chatting cheerfully about my recovery timeline. "Remember, take it easy for the first week," she said, as Michael helped me into the passenger seat, "and don't hesitate to call if you have any concerns." "I'll take good care of her," Michael assured her, and I almost laughed at the irony. The ride home was quiet. Michael made a few attempts at conversation, asking about my pain levels, whether I needed to stop at the pharmacy, but I kept my responses brief. I was thinking about Monday's meeting with Douglas, about the conversation that would finally free me from this web of obligation and guilt. My house looked smaller somehow when we pulled into the driveway. This house that had been my prison of obligation for so many years. This house that they'd been mentally dividing between themselves while I was still breathing. It was a nice house, I'll give them that. A 3-bedroom colonial that Victor and I had bought when the kids were small, with a big yard and mature trees and all the suburban amenities that made it so appealing to potential buyers. Michael helped me inside, fussing over where I should sit, whether I needed anything from upstairs. His guilt was almost palpable, and I wondered if he was remembering his words from the hospital corridor, if some part of him was ashamed of what he'd said. But shame without change is just self-pity, and I was done enabling anyone's self-pity, including my own. "I'll be fine, Michael," I said, settling into my recliner with a book. "Thank you for the ride." "Are you sure? I could stay for a while, maybe make you some dinner." "I'm sure. I have everything I need." He lingered by the door, clearly wanting to say something, but not knowing how. Finally, he mumbled something about calling to check on me and left. I sat in the quiet house, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. For the first time in decades, I didn't have anyone else's needs to consider, anyone else's expectations to meet. I was just Patricia, alone with her thoughts and her plans. That weekend passed quietly. Betty called once to check on me, a perfunctory 5-minute conversation that felt like a performance for both of us. Michael stopped by Sunday afternoon with groceries I didn't need, his guilt manifesting as unwanted helpfulness. Neither of them mentioned Thursday's realtor appointment, probably assuming I'd forgotten about it in my medicated state. They had no idea that their casual cruelty had been my wake-up call, the thing that finally gave me permission to stop living for their approval. Monday morning, I dressed carefully for my meeting with Douglas, not in the comfortable, practical clothes my children expected me to wear, but in a navy suit that I'd bought years ago and barely worn. I wanted to look like the woman I was, not the diminished person they'd convinced me I was. Douglas's office was downtown, in one of those old brick buildings that spoke of tradition and stability. His secretary, Mrs. Jose, had been there almost as long as I'd been a client, and she greeted me with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Patterson, how lovely to see you. Douglas is waiting for you in his office." Douglas rose from behind his mahogany desk as I entered, his silver hair and kind eyes reminding me so much of Victor that I felt a pang of loss. If Victor were alive, would things have been different? Would my children have learned to value me as a person rather than just as a provider? But Victor wasn't here, and I was tired of living in the past. "Patricia," Douglas said, coming around the desk to embrace me carefully. "How are you feeling? Mrs. Jose mentioned you'd had surgery." "I'm healing," I said, and meant it in more ways than one. "Thank you for seeing me so quickly." We sat in the leather chairs by his office window, and I found myself looking out at the busy street below, at all the people going about their lives, unaware that mine was about to change completely. "You mentioned wanting to make changes to your estate plan," Douglas said, pulling out a legal pad. "What did you have in mind?" I took a deep breath. "I want to revoke the existing will entirely. I want to start over." His eyebrows rose slightly. "That's quite a significant change. May I ask what's prompted this decision?" So I told him. Everything. About the conversation I'd overheard in the hospital, about years of being taken for granted, about the gradual erosion of respect and love until I was nothing more than a convenient resource to them. Douglas listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled as I spoke. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry, Patricia," he said finally. "No parent should have to hear that from their children." "But it was good that I did," I said. It opened my eyes to something I'd been refusing to see for years. They don't love me, Douglas. They tolerate me. And I've been enabling that by making myself indispensable to them financially. So what do you want to do? I pulled out the notes I'd made over the weekend. I want to establish a trust fund for my grandchildren's education, something they can't access until they're 18 and can't be touched by their parents. I want to donate a significant portion to charities that support widows and single mothers. And I want to make sure that whatever's left goes to people who actually value me. And your children? They'll get what they've already gotten, years of my time, money, and sacrifice. That's their inheritance. Douglas made notes as we talked, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but he didn't try to talk me out of it. He'd been around long enough to see families torn apart by money and entitlement, and he understood that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let people face the consequences of their choices. "There's one more thing," I said as our meeting wound down. "I want to sell the house and move somewhere they can't find me easily. I want to start over completely." "That's a big step, Patricia. Are you sure?" I thought about the house, about all the memories it held. Birthday parties and Christmas mornings, homework sessions at the kitchen table, the quiet years after Victor died when it was just me and the echo of our former life together. But memories were all it held now. The people who'd made those memories didn't exist anymore, or perhaps they'd never existed at all. Perhaps I'd created a fantasy family in my mind, projecting love and gratitude where there was only calculation and convenience. "I'm sure," I said. "It's time." We spent the next hour going over the practical details: how to structure the trust, which charities to include, the timeline for liquidating my assets. Douglas would handle everything discreetly, ensuring that my children wouldn't know about the changes until after I was gone. Because I had decided something else during that long weekend of reflection. I wasn't going to tell them about the money they weren't getting. I wasn't going to explain or justify or try to make them understand. They'd made their choice in that hospital corridor, and now I was making mine. I was going to disappear from their lives as completely as possible, while I was still alive to enjoy it. Walking out of Douglas's office, I felt lighter than I had in years. For so long I'd been carrying the weight of their expectations, their needs, their subtle contempt. Now I was free to be just Patricia, to figure out what that meant when it wasn't defined by my relationship to other people. The house sold faster than I'd expected. Within 3 weeks, I had a cash offer from a young couple with 2 small children who loved the big yard and mature trees just as much as Victor and I had 30 years earlier. I accepted their offer immediately, pricing it below market value because I could afford to be generous when generosity was my choice, not my obligation. I told Betty and Michael about the sale over dinner at a neutral restaurant, watching their faces carefully as I delivered the news. "You're selling the house?" Betty's voice was sharp with panic. "Mom, that's a huge decision. Don't you think you should have discussed it with us first?" "Why?" I asked mildly. "It's my house." "But where will you go? What about your equity? What about—" She stopped herself before saying, "our inheritance." But we all heard it hanging in the air. "I found a lovely retirement community in Florida," I said. "Active adult living, they call it. I'll have a little villa with a garden and access to all sorts of activities. I'm actually quite excited about it." Michael looked stricken. "Mom, this seems so sudden. Are you sure you're thinking clearly? You've lived in that house for 30 years. "Exactly," I said. 30 years is long enough to stay in one place out of habit. I'm ready for something new. They peppered me with questions for the rest of the meal, about my finances, about whether I could afford this move, about what would happen to my things. I answered vaguely, letting them assume I was making this decision from a position of financial vulnerability rather than strength. Let them think I was spending my last dollars on some fantasy retirement. They'd find out the truth eventually, after I was gone, and they discovered that their careful calculations had been based on completely false assumptions. The hardest part was saying goodbye to my grandchildren. Emma and James, now 8 and 6, had been the bright spots in my life for years. They loved me unconditionally in the way that only children can, without agenda or calculation. But even that relationship had become tainted by their parents' manipulation. I was the free babysitter, the woman who could be counted on to drop everything when Betty and Derek wanted a weekend away. The children loved me, but they'd been taught to see me as infinitely available, infinitely accommodating. I wanted them to remember me differently. "Grandma Pat is going on an adventure," I told them during our last afternoon together as we played in the backyard that would soon belong to someone else. "I'm going to live near the ocean and learn to paint and maybe take dancing lessons." "Can we visit you?" Emma asked, and my heart almost broke at the hope in her voice. "We'll see, sweetheart, I said, knowing that their parents would never make the effort unless they needed something from me. But I'd made provisions for them in my new will, college funds that would give them opportunities their parents could never provide, money that would be available when they were old enough to make their own choices about relationships and family. Moving day came on a brilliantly clear October morning. The professional movers I'd hired worked efficiently, boxing up 30 years of accumulated life and loading it into trucks bound for Florida. I kept very little. Some photos, Victor's books, a few pieces of jewelry that had been my mother's. Everything else could be replaced, or maybe I'd discover I didn't need it at all. Betty and Michael came to say goodbye, both of them still clearly bewildered by the speed of my departure. They'd tried multiple times over the past month to talk me out of the move, alternating between concern for my well-being and barely concealed anxiety about their financial expectations. "Mom, you have our numbers," Betty said, hugging me stiffly. "Call us when you get settled." "Of course," I said, knowing I wouldn't. Michael was more emotional, tears actually appearing in his eyes as he embraced me. "I'm going to miss you," he said, and for a moment I almost believed him. But then I remembered his voice in that hospital corridor, calculating my worth in dollars and cents, and my resolve strengthened. "Take care of yourselves," I said. "Yeah, well," I said. I drove away from that house, from that life, from those people, without looking back. In my rearview mirror, I could see Betty and Michael standing in the driveway, watching me go, probably wondering if they'd ever see me again. They wouldn't, if I could help it. The retirement community I'd chosen was nothing like the modest apartment they'd probably imagined. Sunset Gardens was a luxury development for active adults, with golf courses and tennis courts, art studios and social clubs, a community center that looked like a resort hotel. My villa was small but elegant, with high ceilings and French doors that opened onto a private garden. For the first time in decades, I decorated exactly as I pleased, choosing colors and furnishings that made me happy rather than worrying about what others would think. I made friends quickly, other women who'd reinvented themselves later in life, couples who'd discovered that retirement could be the beginning of adventure rather than the end of purpose. We took painting classes and book clubs, traveled together on group tours to places I'd always wanted to see. For the first time since Victor died, I wasn't lonely. I changed my phone number and didn't give them the new one. I opened new email accounts and closed the old ones. When they tried to reach me through Douglas, he politely informed them that his client had requested no contact. 6 months after I moved, Douglas called to tell me that Betty had hired a private investigator to track me down. The PI had found Sunset Gardens, but the community's strict privacy policies meant he couldn't access resident information without a court order. "They're quite persistent," Douglas said with dry amusement. "Betty's been calling weekly, claiming she's worried about your mental health." "I've never been mentally healthier," I told him truthfully. A year passed, then 2. I heard nothing from my children and felt nothing but relief. The guilt I'd expected to feel never materialized. Instead, I felt lighter, freer, more myself than I'd been in decades. I took up watercolor painting and discovered I had a talent for it. I joined a hiking club and found that my surgically repaired hips were stronger than they'd been in years. I even, to my own surprise, started dating, something I'd never imagined doing after Victor. George was a widower from Ohio, a retired engineer with kind eyes and a gentle sense of humor. He'd lost his wife to cancer 5 years earlier and understood the complicated grief of surviving someone you'd loved deeply. We weren't trying to recreate our past relationships. We were creating something entirely new. "You know what I love about you, Patricia Stjor," he said one evening as we walked along the beach near our community. "You're not trying to be anyone else. You're just completely yourself." If only he knew how recently I'd discovered who that was. 3 years after I disappeared from my children's lives, Douglas called with news I'd been expecting. "Your daughter has filed a petition to have you declared mentally incompetent," he said. "She's claiming you're suffering from dementia and that your decision to isolate yourself from family is evidence of cognitive decline." I laughed, actually laughed, at the audacity of it. What does she hope to accomplish? If she can get a court to declare you incompetent, she could potentially be appointed as your legal guardian, which would give her control over your finances. The finances she still knew nothing about. In her mind, she was fighting for control over a modest Social Security income and whatever I'd gotten from selling the house. She had no idea she was actually trying to claim guardianship over assets worth millions. "What do we need to do?" I asked. "I'll handle the legal response," Douglas assured me. "I have 3 years' worth of documentation showing that you've been making rational, well-informed decisions about your life and finances. Any judge who looks at the evidence will see that you're fully competent." "Good. And Douglas? When this is over, I want to add a codicil to the will. Any family member who attempts to have me declared incompetent forfeits any future consideration in my estate." "Already drafted," he said with satisfaction. "I had a feeling you'd want that protection." The court case was resolved within 6 months, with the judge finding no evidence whatsoever of cognitive decline or mental incompetence. Betty's petition was dismissed, and she was ordered to pay court costs. More importantly, the case created a legal record of her attempt to seize control of my life for financial gain. If she'd had any doubt about my mental state, that doubt should have been erased by the competency evaluation I'd passed with flying colors. But she didn't give up. If anything, the failed court case seemed to make her more desperate. Douglas called again 6 months later. "She's hired a different private investigator," he said. "This one has been asking questions around Sunset Gardens, trying to get employees to provide information about you." "What kind of information?" "Your daily routine, whether you seem confused or disoriented, whether you're managing your own affairs." He's apparently representing himself as working for concerned family members who are worried about your welfare. I felt a familiar anger building, the same cold fury I'd experienced in that hospital bed 4 years earlier. Even now, even after everything, they couldn't let me go. They couldn't accept that I'd chosen to live my life without them. What can we do about it? "I've already done it," Douglas said with grim satisfaction. "I've had the investigator served with a cease and desist order, and I've informed the community management that any further attempts to gather information about you should be referred to my office immediately." "And if they don't stop?" "Then we pursue harassment charges. Patricia, you have every right to live your life in peace without being stalked by your own children." My own children. The words still felt surreal, even after all this time. That night, I stood on my little patio watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, and I thought about the life I'd built here. I thought about George, who was coming to pick me up for dinner in an hour. I thought about my painting class, where I was working on a landscape that actually looked like a landscape instead of an abstract explosion. I thought about the book club meeting tomorrow, where we discuss a novel I'd actually had time to finish reading. I thought about all the ways my life had become fuller, richer, more authentically mine, since I'd stopped trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it. And I realized something that would have shocked the woman I'd been 4 years ago. I didn't miss them. Not Betty with her brittle ambition and casual cruelty. Not Michael with his weak-willed, enabling, and guilty conscience. Not the grandchildren who'd been taught to see me as a convenience rather than a person. I missed the idea of them, the family I'd thought we were. But the actual people they'd revealed themselves to be, I was better off without them. 5 years after I'd overheard that conversation in the hospital corridor, Douglas called with the news I'd been waiting for. "Betty's investigator found someone willing to talk, beside him said. A maintenance worker at Sunset Gardens who was apparently struggling financially. He provided them with your villa number and some general information about your routine." "What happens now?" "Now we wait. My guess is they'll show up unannounced, probably claiming concern for your welfare. Are you prepared for that confrontation?" I thought about it, really thought about it. For 5 years I'd avoided this moment, hoping they'd eventually give up and move on with their lives. But clearly they were more persistent than I'd given them credit for, or more desperate. "Yes," I said. "I think I'm ready." They came on a Tuesday morning in March, just as the community was coming alive, with residents heading out for their morning walks and tennis games. I saw them through my front window, Betty in her business attire looking out of place in the casual Florida setting, Michael beside her wearing the same uncomfortable expression I remembered from so many family gatherings. They knocked on my door with the confidence of people who expected to be welcomed despite everything they'd done to track me down, against my wishes. I let them wait. I finished my coffee, tidied my kitchen, checked my appearance in the hallway mirror. When I finally opened the door, I was perfectly composed. "Hello, Betty. Michael." They both started talking at once, Betty's voice sharp with accusation, Michael's pleading and guilt-ridden. I held up my hand, and something in my expression made them both fall silent. "You're not welcome here," I said quietly. Betty's face flushed with indignation. "Mom, we've been worried sick about you. You disappeared without a word. You won't return our calls." "I changed my phone number," I corrected. "There's a difference." "We had to hire a private investigator just to find out if you were still alive," Michael burst out. "Do you have any idea what you've put us through?" The irony was so perfect it almost made me smile. What I'd put them through. As if my desire for peace and privacy was somehow a cruelty inflicted upon them. "Come in," I said, stepping back from the door. "Let's have this conversation properly." They entered my villa with curious, calculating eyes, taking in the expensive furnishings, the original artwork on the walls, the gleaming hardwood floors. I watched Betty's expression change as she processed what she was seeing. This wasn't the modest apartment of a woman spending her last dollars on a fantasy retirement. "Mom, This place must cost a fortune, she said, her voice tight with confusion. How are you affording all this? Sit down, I said, gesturing to the living room. Both of you. They perched on the edge of my cream-colored sofa like birds ready to take flight, clearly uncomfortable but too curious to leave. I took the chair across from them, the one that gave me the best view of their faces. You want to know how I'm affording this? I asked. You want to know how I've been living for the past 5 years? Let me tell you. I told them about the investments they'd never known about, the rental property in Arizona, the life insurance policies beyond the one they'd been counting on. I told them about Douglas, about the careful financial planning that had been going on behind the scenes while they'd been treating me like a charity case. I watched their faces change as the numbers sank in. Confusion gave way to shock, shock to calculation, calculation to a desperate kind of hunger. $2.3 million? Betty's voice was barely a whisper. You've had $2.3 million this whole time? More now, I said calmly. Compound interest is a beautiful thing. Michael leaned forward, his eyes bright with possibilities. Mom, this is incredible. Do you realize what this means? We could pay off our mortgages, get the kids into better schools. No, I said. The word hung in the air between us like a blade. What do you mean, no? Betty's voice was rising, that familiar edge of entitlement creeping in. Mom, you can't possibly need all that money. You're living alone. You have no major expenses. I said no. But we're your children, Michael protested. We're your family. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the same weak, grasping man who'd stood in a hospital corridor calculating my death like a business transaction. The years hadn't changed him. They'd only made him more desperate. Are you? I asked quietly. Are you my family? Of course we are. Mom, what's gotten into you? This isn't like you at all. That was the moment I'd been building toward for 5 years. Isn't it? Let me tell you what is like me, standing in a hospital room at 2 a.m, listening to my children discuss when I would die and how they'd split my assets. Hearing my daughter call me a burden she can't wait to be rid of. Listening to my son calculate life insurance payouts while I was recovering from surgery. The color drained from both their faces. Betty's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, while Michael actually swayed in his seat as if I'd physically struck him. You heard that? Betty whispered. Every word. When will she just die already? This is taking forever, and I have the realtor coming Thursday. Ring any bells, Betty? She was crying now, ugly tears that smeared her carefully applied makeup. Mom, I didn't mean it. I was stressed. I was worried about you. You were worried about the house. You had a realtor coming to look at property you thought would be yours when I died, while I was still in the hospital. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that. I turned to Michael. And you? $200,000 in life insurance, plus $450 for the house. You had it all calculated, didn't you? Right down to how you'd split it so you could both get your children through college without any more burden. Michael was pale as ash, his hands shaking. Mom, I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. I was scared. I was thinking about Jennifer's medical bills, and you just showed me exactly who you really are. Both of you. I stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the carefully manicured gardens where my neighbors were living their authentic, peaceful lives. Do you want to know what the most painful part was? I asked, not turning around. Not the money talk. I could have forgiven that, maybe, if there had been even a moment of genuine grief in your voices, a moment where you seemed sad that your mother was dying, instead of just impatient for it to happen. We didn't want you to die, Michael said desperately. We love you, Mom. We've always loved you. I turned back to face them. No, you haven't. You've loved what I could do for you. You've loved my free babysitting, my financial help, my willingness to say yes to everything you asked for, but you've never loved me. That's not true. When was the last time either of you called me just to talk? Not because you needed something, not because you felt obligated, but because you genuinely wanted to hear my voice? Silence. When was the last time you asked me about my dreams, my interests, my life outside of what I could provide for you? More silence. When was the last time you treated me like a person instead of a resource? Betty was sobbing openly now. Mom, please. We can fix this. We can do better. Just give us another chance. I gave you chances for 30 years, I said. I gave you my youth, my health, my savings, my time. I gave you everything I had to give, and it was never enough. You always wanted more. I walked to my desk, pulled out a folder I'd been keeping for this moment. These are copies of my will, I said, handing them each a set of papers. The real will, not the one you've been assuming exists. I watched them read, watched their faces go through a complicated dance of emotions as they realized what they were seeing. The trust funds for their children, yes, but nothing for them. The charitable donations, the bequests to friends and causes I cared about. The explicit statement that their attempts to manipulate and control me had resulted in their complete disinheritance. This can't be legal, Betty said, her voice hollow. We're your children. We have rights. You have no rights to money you never earned and inheritance you never deserved. Douglas made sure of that. Michael looked up from the papers, his face gray with shock. Mom, you're giving everything away. To strangers, to charities, but nothing to us, nothing to your own grandchildren. Your children will receive their education funds when they turn 18. They'll have opportunities you could never provide for them, but they'll get those opportunities without learning to see money as something they're entitled to simply by virtue of existing. You can't do this, Betty said, standing abruptly. You can't punish us forever for one conversation. We made a mistake. We said things we didn't mean. You said things you absolutely meant. You said what you've been thinking for years, but were too polite to voice. And you know what? I'm grateful you finally told the truth. It freed me to tell the truth, too. What truth? Michael asked. That I don't like the people you've become. That I don't enjoy spending time with you. That every interaction we've had for the past decade has felt like a transaction where I give and you take, and my feelings are nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed. I walked to the front door and opened it. I want you to leave now. I want you to drive back to whatever lives you've built without me, and I want you to stay there. Mom, please. Betty started toward me, but I stepped back. If you attempt to contact me again, I'll pursue harassment charges. If you try to have me declared incompetent again, I'll make sure the court sees the recordings I have of this conversation. If you violate my privacy by hiring more investigators, I'll file for a restraining order. Recordings? Michael asked weakly. I gestured to the small device on my coffee table, its red light still blinking. I've learned to protect myself. Something you taught me to do. They left without another word, Betty's sobs echoing in the hallway as they walked away. I watched through my window as they sat in their rental car for nearly an hour, probably trying to figure out some new angle, some way to salvage what they'd thought was their birthright. Eventually, they drove away. That evening, George came over with dinner and found me on my patio, painting a sunset that looked almost exactly like the one spreading across the real sky. Good day, he asked, settling into the chair beside me. The best day I've had in years, I said honestly. He didn't ask for details. One of the many things I loved about him was his respect for privacy, his understanding that some stories were too personal to share, even with people we cared about. But later, as we sat together watching the stars come out, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Complete contentment. Not the resigned acceptance I'd mistaken for peace during those years of being taken for granted, but actual genuine happiness. I'd spent so much of my life trying to be the mother I thought I should be. Endlessly giving, endlessly forgiving, endlessly available. I'd thought that love meant never saying no, never setting boundaries, never protecting my own interests. But real love, I'd learned, requires respect. And respect can't exist without boundaries. My children had never learned to respect me because I'd never demanded it. I'd been so afraid of losing their love that I'd accepted their indifference instead. I'd been so desperate to be needed that I'd allowed myself to be used. Well, I wasn't needed anymore. And for the first time in my adult life, I was exactly where I belonged. 6 months later, Douglas called to tell me that Betty had attempted to contest the will, claiming I'd been unduly influenced by my isolation and depression. The case was dismissed when the judge reviewed the extensive documentation of my mental competency and the recordings of our final conversation. She's also been asking questions about your health, Douglas added, apparently trying to determine if you have any terminal illnesses that might speed up her timeline. I wasn't surprised. Betty had always been practical about pursuing her goals, even when those goals were morally reprehensible. What did you tell her? That my client's health information is confidential. But Patricia, She seems to be getting more desperate, more erratic. I'm concerned she might escalate. Let her, I said. I'm not afraid of her anymore. And I wasn't. Fear had been the emotion that controlled me for so many years. Fear of disappointing my children, fear of being alone, fear of being seen as a failure as a mother. But fear was just another cage, and I'd finally learned how to open the door. A year later, I married George in a small ceremony in the community garden, surrounded by friends who'd chosen to be in my life rather than feeling obligated to tolerate me. It was my second wedding, but in many ways it felt like my first. The first time I'd entered into a partnership as a complete person rather than someone desperately trying to earn love through service. We honeymooned in Italy, something I'd dreamed of doing since I was a young woman but had never prioritized over my children's needs. We walked through art museums and ate gelato and made love in a villa overlooking the Tuscan hills, and I felt like I was finally living the life I'd postponed for decades. On our last night in Florence, I stood on our hotel balcony looking out at the ancient city, and George came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. I thought about it seriously, running through the choices that had brought me here. The decision to disappear from my children's lives, the money I'd redirected away from them toward causes that mattered to me, the years of potential relationship I'd chosen to sacrifice for peace and authenticity. None, I said, and meant it completely. Because the truth is, you can't lose something you never really had. My children's love had been conditional from the start, conditional on my usefulness, my availability, my willingness to make their lives easier at the expense of my own dignity. What I'd gained by walking away was so much more valuable than what I'd lost. I'd gained self-respect, genuine companionship, the freedom to make choices based on my own desires rather than other people's expectations. I'd gained the right to be seen as a whole person rather than just someone's mother, someone's resource, someone's burden. Most importantly, I'd gained the knowledge that it's never too late to start over. That even after decades of living someone else's version of your life, you can still choose to become who you were always meant to be. Now at 72, I wake up every morning excited about the day ahead. I paint watercolors that hang in the community art show. I've learned to play bridge and discovered I'm quite good at it. George and I have traveled to 6 countries together, and we're planning a trip to Alaska next year. I volunteer at a local shelter for women escaping domestic violence, and I've started a small scholarship fund for adult women returning to college after raising children. My money goes toward causes I care about, people who need help building the kind of authentic, self-determined life I was fortunate enough to create for myself. Sometimes I wonder what happened to Betty and Michael, whether they ever learned anything from our final conversation. But the wondering doesn't hurt anymore. It's more like curiosity about distant acquaintances than the aching concern I used to feel about their well-being. I hope they found happiness somewhere, somehow. I hope they learned to build relationships based on genuine affection rather than mutual exploitation. I hope their children grow up to be kinder, more grateful people than their parents turned out to be, but their happiness is no longer my responsibility. That was perhaps the hardest lesson of all, learning that loving someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself for them, especially when they've shown you that your sacrifice means nothing to them. The woman I was 5 years ago would be horrified by the choice I made. She would see it as selfish, unforgiving, a failure of maternal love. But the woman I am now understands that the most loving thing I could do, for them and for myself, was to stop enabling their exploitation and start modeling what self-respect looks like. I heard my daughter say, "When will she just die already?" And I realized that in every way that mattered, I already had died. The person I'd been, the endlessly giving, endlessly accommodating mother who lived only through other people's needs, she died in that hospital corridor. What was born in her place was someone I'd never had the chance to be before. Patricia Patterson, a woman who knew her own worth and refused to accept anything less than the respect she deserved. And that woman, it turns out, is someone worth living for.